So what's really interesting about these two fuel sources is that when either one of them are in excess, they have the ability to switch off the breaking down of the other one. So what does that mean? So for example, let's say we want to burn more fat. So we're breaking down more fat, and more fat is coming into, or fatty acids is coming into the cell. The cell gets the signal that, oh, we have more abundance of fat, so I'm going to switch off glucose burning. On the other side, we can actually do that with glucose too. So if we have more glucose coming into the cell, more abundance of glucose and less fat, then the body is going to be able to switch over to more of a glucose burning state rather than a fat burning state. So if you're interested in the biochemistry, stick with me. So let's say we've put ourselves into a situation where we're able to actually break down the fat that's on our body. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the triglycerides, which is how we store fat, and snip them up, and we end up with these things called free fatty acids. They will then come into the cell and they'll go through a process called beta oxidation. Now, what's really interesting about this is we end up getting a lot of something called NADH and a lot of acetyl-CoA. You don't really need to understand too much what they are, but all you need to know is that when we're breaking down a lot of fat, we produce a lot of these molecules, and they're able to actually go to a step in glucose breakdown, glycolysis, which is a very special enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase, which is essentially the last step of glycolysis before glucose gets put into the Krebs cycle or the mitochondria. And so if we inhibit that enzyme, it stops glucose being able to be broken down and essentially inhibits that process. So another interesting thing is when we're doing a lot of this beta oxidation or the breakdown of fat, we're also going to be producing a lot of something else called citrate within the mitochondria. And this can actually go to another step of glucose breakdown called PFK1, which is an enzyme, and actually inhibit that. So essentially, when we're breaking down a whole lot of fat, we end up with byproducts, and those products are going to be able to go to glycolysis and stop that glycolysis process, so that the cell essentially can use its energy to break down fat and make energy from that. So what if you're consuming more carbohydrates? Well, then of course the body is going to switch over and preferentially use glucose as the main fuel source. Interestingly enough, the biochemistry with this is that as we break down more glucose, we end up producing something called malonyl-CoA, a lot of it, and that actually goes to the mitochondria and switches off a very important step for fat breakdown, which is called CPT1. If you ever heard of carnitine, this is where carnitine comes in. If we switch that off, then we can't actually break down fat. But what happens if we have an excess of both fuel sources floating around? So in this case, what is going to be the deciding factor is a very important hormone called insulin. Insulin is going to inhibit lipolysis and inhibit the oxidation of fat. So it's going to stop fat being broken down at tissues where it's been stored, like fat cells. And then it's going to also inhibit the ability for us to oxidize that fat, so actually break it down and snip it up so that we can make energy from it. It's going to preferentially make us use glucose as our main energy source. So it will make us break down glucose in the cell and convert that to ATP. And a really, really interesting example of this is people that have type 1 diabetes, because if we don't have any insulin floating around, then there's no signal at the cell to bring in glucose and use it for energy. There's also nothing inhibiting us from being able to cause lipolysis at the cells, so cause us to start releasing out free fatty acids from our cells, and also the oxidation of fat in the mitochondria. So essentially, if insulin is low or not present, then there's nothing inhibiting fat breakdown. So of course the cell is going to preferentially use fat if it also can't access glucose. Another interesting example of insulin's role here is if you have type 2 diabetes, you actually have excess insulin. So you have a lot of insulin floating around, but it's not really doing its job properly at all tissues. So you're not going to be able to stop the breakdown of fat at, say, our fat tissue. So you're actually breaking it down and releasing it out into the bloodstream. But because insulin's high, insulin won't let you actually oxidize that fat. So you can't actually bring that fat in and use it for energy. So in this situation, it's a really sad situation actually, because of the high insulin levels, you're not able to use fat as energy. So the cell is like looking for energy, But at the same time, there's a lot of tissues that actually are resistant now to insulin, so they can't really bring glucose properly into the cell either. So you're just basically starved in the land of plenty. Very sad. So in summary, what it's really coming down to when our cells are deciding if they're going to use fat as energy or glucose as energy really comes down to, number one, what fuel source is most available. So if you're mainly breaking down fat and having that available to the cell, you're mainly bringing in fat, then of course the cell's going to preferentially use fat. On the other hand, if you're supplying majority carbohydrates and glucose, then the cell will choose glucose. But on top of that as well, there is that big player, which is insulin. So essentially, if insulin is raised, you're going to preferentially use glucose. So it's important to note that if we eat majority carbohydrates, our cells are mainly going to use carbohydrates. But of course, with that comes insulin. You get a higher bump up of insulin when you consume carbohydrates. And while you could be consuming a diet that is primarily fat and not really much carbs at all, whenever you break a fast, provided that you're not a type 1 diabetic, each time you break the fast and eat food, even if it is just primarily fat and protein, you are going to actually increase insulin a little bit. So for a period of time, you will actually be preferentially using a little bit of carbohydrates, perhaps maybe even just what you've created in your body. But it won't take very long for that insulin to bump back down, and then you will start releasing out that fat again and start using that primarily as your energy source. If you bring in a lot of carbohydrates and perhaps you're insulin resistant, then of course that insulin is going to stay up longer, and then you are going to have a harder time breaking through fat that you have in your body. You're going to preferentially use glucose.